Landy made it great. Okay, so I'm also going to share my screen, and that should be this one. As I get this over, push this off to the side. So this workshop, as everybody should know, is the pond turtle nesting ecology workshop. So generally speaking, this used to be called the Western Pond Turtle Nesting Ecology Workshop, but as most of you know or should know, the turtle's been split into at least two species, and that may change. We'll talk about that. So I'm just going to refer to this as the Pond Turtle Nesting Ecology Workshop, and I'll refer to both species as pond turtles. I won't really focus too much on whether it's southwestern or northwestern, although we'll go through that kind of information. And we'll literally talk about how to differentiate the two and the problems with that. But the point will be just to be talking about pond turtles in general, both species, or if you're really a hair splitter, probably three species. And we'll see how all this goes. So we're going to start really quickly with status, range, and ID. This is sort of the boring stuff. We'll get it out of the way early. So status, in terms of it having a true status, that occurred in 1994 with this. Bless you.
Excuse me, sorry.
Uh,
I will mute myself.
Thanks, Landy. I think that's you. So we're going to start with 1994. Jennings and Hayes wrote this amphibian reptile species of special concern book. It still has really good summary information on the natural history of pond turtle. It's obviously outdated. It's now essentially 30 years old. So the information isn't up to date, but it's really pretty accurate and still pretty good. And I would use that as a reference source. It's available online as a PDF. I think it's a good source of information. The newer version of the same kind of guide came out here in 2015 or 16, I can't remember which, by Thompson, Wright, and Schaefer. And this was a group of people who won a contract with CDFW and put together this book. It's a beautiful book. It's out of print already and is now a PDF, which you can get both of them online from CDFW. This book has a similar natural history kind of summary, and I would say, I'm trying to be sort of politically correct here. I would say that if you had the choice between the two, pick the older one over the newer one. The newer one has good relevant information, but they had a tendency to cite friends and family and ignore huge amounts of other information that's out there. So effectively, it was outdated within about a year. I think that it can be helpful if you have access to it, but if you're going to cite one of these two, I would cite the Jennings and Hayes as opposed to the Thompson et al. They're both valuable to have since they're both free. You should download both of them. After this lecture, I'll email everybody and send them a list of all of the pond turtle literature that's available and a link to I think it's on some sort of file share. I'll send that over to you, and that'll have all of the literature that I've found that's available currently up to yesterday, and you'll have access to that. So the status has changed quite a bit, and I'm going to just sort of summarize this in a general way. So the northwestern pond turtle, as a species of its own, is currently a California state species of special concern. If you're working on this animal in Oregon, it's a critical species. If you're working on it in Washington State, it's endangered. And then it was petitioned for federal listing in 2013. Almost 10 years later, 11 years later, it looks like it's going to be listed the end of this year. It's hard to tell exactly when. There's a bunch of political stuff going on. But it seems likely that it's going to be the end of this year. The service, I'm going to do quote fingers. The service wants to list this. That's a rare position for them. They think it's really quite necessary. And it looks like it'll be listed, but we're not sure if it's going to be listed as threatened or endangered, but I'll say something about that in a minute. Now we also have southwestern pond turtle, which is, I'll show you the range maps in the next few slides. It's also California state species of concern, petition for listing in 2013. This one was elevated in 2022 to priority listing, which drug along the northwestern pond turtle. So once The southwestern pond turtle got elevated to priority listing. It dragged the northwestern pond turtle along with it, so both species are likely to be listed. Now this kind of gives us that, puts us in that position of wondering who's going to be listed as what, which is going to be listed at what level. The service has got a lot of problems with this, and we'll talk about it with the range. Right now, and by that I mean like this week, they think they might be listing it as both species will be threatened, and that'll settle a problem that we're going to talk about in a minute. They would prefer northwestern pond turtle to be threatened and southwestern to be endangered, but they'll be sued over that and they know it, so it may be that they just list both of them as threatened. The other option that they're considering is northwestern stays state species of concern and southwestern becomes threatened. But this is kind of elevated beyond the field level biologist and recovery team for the turtle. So now I also added in Baja California pond turtle. That hasn't officially been split off yet, and we'll talk about that when I talk about the range. But I'm just adding it in there so you know that there is genetically another group of turtles that start around San Diego County and go south into Baja. It's still, as you know, they're all grouped together with the state as a state species of concern. It was also lumped in with the. Sorry, did you have a question,
Oh,
Trisha?
sorry. I'm out in the field and accidentally unmuted myself.
No problem.
Thanks.
Uh, so this was petitioned for listing along with the other two species. Like I say, it hasn't been split off. In Mexico, they see it as its own species, but there is no status currently. But for now, we're only going to see these as two species, northwestern and southwestern, with the southwestern having the Baja lumped in. So all of these turtles are in the Amididae family. So that essentially means they're basking turtles, and we use their basking behavior to our advantage. We can put out a basking platform and ID turtles from a distance, which is super helpful. And we'll use that to our advantage when we're out in the field next week or so. So here's, we're getting into the taxonomy, but also the range issues here. So we're going to look at the left side map first. Back in the old days, and that means when I was in school, this was the 80s, 90s. This used to just be referred to as a western pond turtle with subspecies. So in this map with the big red blobs, the number 1 was the northwestern subspecies, the number 2 was the southwestern subspecies, and this big green hashed area was the intergrade zone where nobody knew what was going on, and they just said, oh, don't worry about it, it's just the species. You didn't try to differentiate northwestern from southwestern. More recently, and by that I mean around 2010 or so, Spinks and others were trying to figure out really what is going on with the turtle genetically, and did some sampling really mostly from museum specimens, so not a lot of live captures. And by mostly museum specimens, I mean only museum specimens, which was really restrictive in their data, and their data now is being considered quite controversial. But this was the map we used for almost 10 years. So the green was northwestern pond turtle as its own species. The yellow was southwestern pond turtle as its own species. And the Baja was just a recommended new species. And like I said, around San Diego and then southward. And just to end the Baja discussion, the Baja pond turtle in San Diego County only occurs in 3 ponds. So it's relatively irrelevant in our state, but it's really pretty important in Mexico. The little pink box that you see around Contra Costa County and part of Alameda County reflected this little intergrade zone that we knew we would see both subspecies or species depending on who you were, and that related to a lot of turtle farming early in the 1900s, where people brought turtles from the Central Valley, turtle farmed them in those 2 counties, and then eventually they got released or escaped, and so there's this sort of mix of them in that area. But that itself is also controversial, and we'll move on to that one right here. So now we're going to focus on some new work that's been done. So again, a lot of genetic work has been done very recently in the last couple of years. A couple of papers came out, and they're looking still at that big green blob as northwestern pond turtle as a species. The yellow is southwestern pond turtle as a species. And then this little 3-county, 4 or 5-county area, typically Contra Costa County down to this very south end of Santa Clara County and parts of Santa Cruz County. as the intergrade zone. And by intergrade zone, we mean, or they meant, the untested zone. So they looked at very, very few individuals in this area, saw a lot of intergradation, couldn't really tell one species from another, and we just don't know what to do with it. So all the papers that are out now really say it's pretty clear where the northwestern is, it's pretty clear where the southwestern is, but it's not clear at all where what's going on in this mixed area. So the service has decided, if they list it, that they're drawing a line right there along essentially northern Monterey County, San Benito County, and into Merced County, and everything south of that will be southwestern. Everything north of Contra Costa County will be northwestern, and they're going to include the foothills in the Central Valley. And this little section in the middle, they want to call northwestern, but they're already in some trouble about that because they can't justify it. So there'll be lawsuits. There'll definitely be lawsuits about that, and it's going to just be unsettled during the listing process. For right now, as we talk about these two as species, and I'll show you how to differentiate them the best way we know how currently, this area is really going to still be unknown, and until the service just like states in writing what they want us to do, it's hard to know what we have here, quite honestly. What we also know from our own work is there's a little zone here in Solano, Napa, Sonoma, and Marin County where we also see what effectively is an intergradation, but that's not recognized by either agency. And by the way, the state doesn't necessarily recognize the two species yet. They're still looking at it as subspecies. So this is quite a big mess right now. And to be honest, I think if you just say pond turtle, you're going to always be safe. Northwestern and southwestern are pretty clearly different species genetically, and also you can see morphological characteristics, but this area that we're staring at here is just going to be a big mess for a while. So
Can I ask a question?
yeah, of course.
What do you think is the best way to get clarity on that? Does somebody just need to go around and do a ton of genetic testing, do a huge project? Is that even necessary for like a good conservation approach?
It's a really important question. I would first start by saying, yes, somebody needs to just focus on these Bay Area counties and really look at a fine scale and see what's going on. We know genetically you can tell if a turtle came from, this creek or that creek, so they know the differences in the populations pretty well. It's probably going to be that we are looking at a species that is diverging, like we're in the divergent period, and that there is just a big intergradation zone here that we don't really fully understand. The agencies have to deal with this though, so they do have to draw a line. And one of their solutions is to consider both of them threatened. And in doing so, it doesn't matter which species you have. You just have a pond turtle. They're all threatened. You deal with it as a threatened animal. Probably the best solution. But yeah, if somebody wants to do a PhD, this is going to be a really important work and would get a lot of attention once you finished.
Thank you.
So morphologically, here's what we have used since 1944. Selinger wrote a paper. She really looked at the differences in the morphology and saw that there were two different scales that look quite different. We still use this for the most part, and there's a whole big trick to this, but I'll focus mostly on the scales themselves. So in the upper right corner, there is an inguinal scute. The arrow is pointing right to that little scute. The scute is just a scale. And it's either reduced, so small, or missing altogether in the southwestern pond turtle. And if you look to the lower left, it's not as clear, but there's a triangular scute there on the northwestern pond turtle, and it's always present in the northwestern pond turtle, but there's a little bit of a thing there. But the point is just to look at the scale shape. And so I'm putting this in here to say if it looks like a grain of rice, or it's not there at all, that's southwestern pond turtle typically. And if it looks like a triangle about the size of your pinky fingernail, it's northwestern pond turtle typically. Now here's what they found out with the genetics. So if they sampled turtles, we'll just focus on the southwestern pond turtle scute size. If they sampled turtles with a grain of rice shape or missing inguinal scute, 95% of the time, that was a southwestern pond turtle. But when they sampled turtles with the triangular scute, only about 80% of the time was that a northwestern pond turtle. So what that means is occasionally southwestern pond turtles have a big scute. And what that probably means is it's an intergrade. And we have turtles, and we will see this if you come into the field with us. We'll have a turtle with a left side having a grain of rice size and a right side having the triangular size. So we just call those hybrids. It's not like a hybrid matters because they're all pond turtles, but pond turtles don't know the difference. They're not looking at their scutes. They don't care. They're just going to mate anyway. So in the end, the service will probably figure this out by drawing a line, and we'll just live with the line. But they will be definitely sued over it. They know it. It's coming because they don't have the scientific rationalization or results to support what the line they're going to draw. And for people who have to deal with, are you on the south side line or the north side line? It will make a difference if the status is different. If one is endangered and one is threatened, that will make a huge difference, and the lawsuits will happen immediately. If they're both threatened, we'll probably just shrug and wait for somebody to do the genetics.
Hey, Jeff, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How, if even at all, visible are those features from binoculars or scopes without having to trap and handle the turtle?
Yeah. Absolutely zero.
Okay, I figured.
It's hard when you're even looking at them in the hand sometimes. And when we catch turtles over the weekend, I'll use a little pointer to point at it, and we'll be holding the leg out. And on this upper photo, you can see I'm extending the leg out because when the leg is in its normal position, it's hiding that scute. You can't tell where it is or what it looks like. If the turtle's 5 feet away from me, even if you're holding it in the right angle, I would still struggle with some of these. So scope or binoculars, zero chance.
Got it. So there's really no easy way to detect them without handling them in the field, which might have repercussions when the listings are finalized and getting proper permits, et cetera.
Yeah,
Trapping.
it is going to be a big issue, and we'll talk about that in the field. In that, I recommend before it gets listed, so we have several months here, try to get an SCP with your turtle on it, because then you'll be grandfathered in for the federal level permitting, meaning they'll just let you do it. They'll let you have a permit without them saying to you, you have to work with somebody with a federal permit already. That's their sort of go-to. You have to work with a permitted person in order to get experience. But in the first year or so of them trying to permit people, if you've already done work on the state level with a permit, then they'll just allow you to get a permit using that experience. But yeah, you're gonna have to trap if they designate these as different levels of, like, their status is different. If they make that choice of making them both threatened, then we don't have to trap. It's a pond turtle, we're good.
Got it. Thank you.
It's gonna give us some grief, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So pond turtles in general, I sort of want to speak about them generally because I want to kind of clue you in on a big issue that we have kind of pending. A group of students and I are working on a paper where we're looking at all of the turtles that exist in California. So we have our two species. We're going to just call them two species, northwestern and southwestern. Then there is 17 other species that are not native to California that look like pond turtle. Some of them look very much like pond turtle, and a couple of them look like you're going to have these photos in your hands to send me, for me to say, I think that's a pond turtle, or I think that's a river cooter, or a peninsula cooter, or a Florida cooter, or whatever. And I would ask actually that you also collect a photo of the face, like straight on, like looking right into its eyes, because some of the facial features will matter on some of these species. But if you don't get really accurate photos with a lot of good light, it's really pretty impossible to differentiate some of these species from one another. And that is to say, in the hand. So if you have a turtle sitting on a log or a patch of cattail, or it's just floating in the water, and you shoot a few photos and you send those to me or somebody like me and say, what species is this? Half the time I should be saying, I don't know. And the rest of the time I'll be saying, I think it's this. There are plenty of times where you'll be able to just differentiate these. You know, a good angle with the right light and turtles doing the right thing. Yeah, we can tell the difference. But there'll be lots and lots of times where you're not going to be able to know the difference. And there'll be occasions, especially in Southern California, where you're going to have this animal in your hand with those photos I mentioned. So straight down at the carapace, straight down at the plastron, and face on, and for anybody to really be able to positively identify that. And if you're not seeing what I'm pointing out, that means you have to trap. So get that turtle trapping on your SCP, start trapping as soon as you can to get the experience so that when it gets federally listed, you'll be able to trap right away, rather than hiring somebody like me where I say, oh, I see you need me, so my rate just doubled. You don't need that. Nobody needs that. I'm pretty busy. It doesn't matter. So just get the experience as soon as possible. So we're going to go through the male and female differentiation, and I'm kind of giving you like a lot of background natural history because it's going to give you context for all the nesting stuff that's going to come near the end. So male and female, this isn't straightforward. It isn't critical either for the most part unless you're trapping and you're doing some long-term demographic study. But just so you know, these things do matter in the big picture. The other thing I'm going to point out before I continue on this pathway is there will be about 5% of these turtles where you will probably not know whether they're male or female. It's probably not going to matter. Some are very easy, some are very, very hard. And on occasion, on a study we had that we were doing for 12 years in a row, we were trapping turtles and marking them and collecting them every single year. And the data sheet would say, oh, number 67, male. Oh, number 67, female. Number 67, male. Number 67, female. And whomever was trapping really couldn't tell. And we just went back and forth until one day I caught them and felt, palpated for eggs and found eggs. And okay, now we know it's a female. Otherwise, these physical characteristics help for most of them, but some of them, it just won't matter. So for the most part, you flip the turtle over and you're looking for characteristics like this. So we have a male, we know it is a male on the right and a female on the left. What you're looking for is, where is the cloaca relative to the edge of the carapace? Is it really close on or within the carapace, so closer to the guts than it is open space? Or is the cloaca way away from the turtle's shell, the carapace? And if it's way away, then it's a male. And if it's at the margin or within the margin, then it's a female. And you can get them there where they're like, this is sort of away and sort of close, I can't really tell. So we use multiple characteristics. This little notch at the end where the tail has access to movement is really pretty helpful too. So if it's a very wide open, almost 180 degrees, and by that we'd never measure it, but probably somebody could for a nice little study. If it's a very open angle, it's probably a male, and if it's a closed angle closer to 90 degrees, then it's a female. Again, a lot of variability. If it's slightly concave, so there's a dip right about where you would imagine the belly button to be, that's probably male, and if it's flat, probably female. Now we've got them where females have a dent and males have it flat, but these are mostly going to work. And then tail length. Tail length is a relative thing. When you start seeing a sort of a shorter tail, generally female, very long tail, generally male. But again, these things kind of have to be added together. And then the female's face is often mottled, and the male's face is typically not very mottled. And as you go south in their distribution, the males show much, much less mottling. So that one is also variable. And then keep in mind the young ones all have mottled faces. So here's pretty typical mottled versus not mottled face for male and female. So the female is pretty typically mottled, including that upper jaw, the bony structure on the upper jaw. The male, pretty typically not very mottled, but this really, again, only comes in the older animals. And then the carapace shape. So the upper shell is more rounded on a female and less rounded on a male. You have to see a bunch of these to get used to it, but once you do, you can differentiate them sitting out on a basking log. So female kind of helmet shaped, male sort of flat. Okay, so natural history, and natural history is going to matter because where they live and how they live will dictate where they're going to nest, and we're going to get to the nesting, trust me. So pond turtle, in its name, it says essentially where they live. Any ponded habitat, so a ponded river, stream, creek, they put up a dam somewhere and slow down some water, turtles are going to like it. Typically, this is a pool adapted animal. By pool adapted, I don't mean it has to have a pool. It doesn't have to have slow water that can occur in moving water too, but definitely appreciates this sort of slower water that's warmer, and typically it's something you would kind of sit at and have your lunch. But then again, they occur in lots of rivers throughout the state. This is the Russian River. This is a managed system, so they do occur upstream and downstream of dams. There's a fish ladder in this case. The turtles are not going to use it. They're going to go probably up the rocks or up the bank and around. So these kinds of systems, even though they have obstacles and barriers, are still used by turtles. Coastal and foothill creeks and streams. So these are typically going to be very dynamic. Lots of whitewater, riffle, run, even rapids. The turtles are going to be, on average, much, much smaller in these kinds of habitats because these habitats are cooler. The turtles have to be moving more. They're burning a lot more energy. But these habitats work quite well. It makes no difference that the water is moving. This is just where they have to live, and they manage it just fine. Any freshwater lake or reservoir, like the state is building reservoirs occasionally, turtles just show up there. The presence of fish doesn't exclude turtles. It can reduce recruitment, but it doesn't exclude turtles. So any sort of freshwater lake or reservoir can support turtles, no problem. Cattle stock ponds tend to be a relatively new feature on the landscape. So most cattle stock ponds were constructed from about 1950 onward. So these are new habitats that turtles are using, and they definitely like them a lot. Agricultural ditches and drainage ponds. This happens a lot in the Central Valley where they'll put in a development and they dig a deep hole, and it's essentially a drainage pond for rainwater during rain events. Turtles use those even though they dry for about half the year. These agricultural ditches are the same way. They might pump water out onto alfalfa fields and dry this ditch, but the turtles will just manage anyway, even if the system is drying out. Speaking of dry, the Mojave River has pond turtles in it. The little inset photo on the back is, if you are looking at the river in one direction, then turn your back, that's what you see, that little inset. Pure desert, creosote bush, no water, but the Mojave River flows through the system, and there are turtles in the river there too. So even sort of atypical habitat, if it's wet and they have some upland to use, they're going to use it. Then created ponds and pools. So keep in mind that the turtles will use vernal pools. They just move through them and feed in them and move out. But created ponds, mitigation ponds for tiger salamander, red-legged frog, or other species are excellent habitat for pond turtles. This is a site I worked on where there's a creek in the background there, and there were turtles in it. They constructed this pond, and within a couple of weeks, the turtles were already using the pond. So they're going up into the upland, looking around, seeing new habitat, and going right for it. And then a site I am very, very familiar with, which is sewage treatment ponds. And this is essentially the habitat we're going to go to when we do the field event. Sewage treatment ponds, I'm told by the people who manage these, are supposed to be called wastewater treatment ponds, but you know what's in them. These really provide excellent habitat for lots of reasons. First, the area surrounding it is protected because they don't want people touching the water. So they have protected habitat surrounding these pools. The pools are perennial because we're always flushing toilets, even in a drought. It makes no difference. You're still going to flush your toilet. So they're always water present. They're highly nutrient rich. So you can imagine what's in there. It's a nice big soup of nutrients. Lots of animals, invertebrates, and even other vertebrates can thrive in this. The turtles feed on those things. They do really well. Then all this nutrient-rich water that doesn't move very much gets warmed up very quickly, and turtles really appreciate those warmer temperatures. So everything that they need is right here in a wastewater treatment pond. And if you looked at all the wastewater treatment sites in California, all of which are constructed, so they're not natural, they tend not to be associated with natural water bodies because they don't want cross-contamination. Turtles have found these. Even in weird areas where, it's like a completely urban setting and there's a wastewater treatment site, turtles find them anyway. I'm not exactly sure how, but they definitely do. And they do really well. So the largest turtle ever recorded was found in a wastewater treatment pond. And the ones we will trap when we're out on our field site are going to be probably twice the size of any turtle you would find in a river or a creek. Some creeks do pretty well. Turtles can get big because creeks tend to be smaller and warmer. But things like the Trinity River, Mad River, Sacramento River, all those rivers, turtles tend to be a little smaller. At the site we're going to go to, they'll be quite large for their age. And then ephemeral creeks and pools. So I put this in here because I think people often misunderstand turtles' ability to survive things. So in an ephemeral system where it's going to dry up for maybe half the year, all that means is the turtle's going to move upland, wait it out until the water comes back, and then it's going to go back to the water. The important aspect about the water is turtles only feed in water. So if they're up in the upland, they're not feeding at all, they're just fasting. When the water comes back, so the flows come up or the pool fills up, turtle will go back, start feeding again, feed as much as it can, dries out, they go back up into the upland. So ephemeral creeks and pools work just as well as perennial creeks and pools. Turtles tend to be smaller in these systems, but it doesn't mean they're excluded from these systems. And then something I'm going to try to talk to you about when we're in the field quite a bit is, although I've showed you lots of aquatic habitat, the turtle really requires a significant amount of upland habitat. This is really critical for lots of reasons. So if the aquatic site dries, they need somewhere to go. They want to go into the upland, typically under some sort of canopy. They'll bury under leaf litter, under a log, or just under some soil. They don't dig into the ground, but they'll push their way under the ground. And the upland becomes essential for them. So if you're protecting an aquatic site because you have turtles, but they've moved into the upland and that's where you're going to do some ground disturbing, you have essentially taken out half the habitat that they require. And that doesn't even count things like nesting, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I saw just a chat pop up. I said pond turtles in Modoc County. Yeah. Just feel free to say, hey, I have a question or a comment. So the comment/question was, there are turtles in Modoc County, and my range map didn't seem to include that area. My range map is really generalized. There are definitely isolated populations in lots of places, and the point was really to kind of show you the general range of northwestern versus southwestern. But some of the newer maps are going to include some of these isolated populations, including the new field guide that will come out in January. So I highly recommend you get that. But even more so, and I'll talk about this in the field, I recommend you, if you are actually seeing a pond turtle, northwestern or southwestern, get it on iNaturalist, because some of these new locations we don't know anything about, but some of them are going to just be translocations too, where people collected a turtle and they moved it to some other site. But all that's important stuff. So habitat within the range is really critical to understand, but the range is even critical to understand, and I'm glad that comment came up. So this is just to show you that they put in this reservoir. This is a project I worked on. They put in this reservoir. It used to just be an ephemeral creek system, had maybe 4 or 5 dozen turtles in the whole creek. They put in the reservoir, and there were, after about 10 years, there are about maybe 6,000 or 7,000 turtles in this site. Now this reservoir had huge catfish, striped bass, lots of largemouth bass, lots of other fish, and the turtles don't really like that much, but they'll just go up into the lower arms where the water is slower and warmer and the water is shallower, and they'll manage just fine in these systems. But part of the reason I'm showing you this photo is we're looking at the aquatic habitat here in the center, but everything around it is upland habitat for turtles. And at this particular site, there are 90 stock ponds that are surrounding this reservoir, and about 10 of them immediately got turtles that that migrated to those ponds because the edge of the reservoir took them closer to ponds that they could access. Now, I would argue that these turtles didn't know there were ponds in the upland. They just wandered into the upland. And they tend to do that quite a bit, especially in this time of year. And if they find good aquatic habitat, they stay there. And if they don't, they keep moving until they find something new. Turtles can move over all kinds of landscapes, irrespective of the topography or the vegetation. All they have to do is be able to move and not be eaten, because they don't need to eat for 3 or 4 or 5 months in a row. They just need to stay cool. So a turtle that's found in this reservoir doesn't like it and it wants to move, say, to the upper left portion of this habitat, can walk up a slope, through chaparral, through rock piles, and then end up in somebody's pond, that they built for their cattle. So just because turtles aren't present at the time you're doing your survey doesn't mean they won't pop up there sometime. Here's sort of a kind of more typical habitat, just a little creek system. This creek system was ephemeral, and then beavers came in and constructed a dam, which is right there at the base of that very green stuff in the creek, and made a nice pool, which created perfect habitat for turtles. And turtles came in here very, very quickly, colonized the creek, and then essentially took over. But what this photo is showing you is something a little bit different. So initially, and by that I mean my early years from about maybe the mid 80s through about 2005, we recognized that turtles need upland habitat for nesting. So we would protect, maybe about 50 meters of habitat on either side of a creek and say, okay, you can't put in trails or development or whatever. And if you did about 50 meters, we thought everything was going to be good for the turtles. And that occurred maybe up into about the early to, probably about 2010. And then as less 10, 15 years approached, we were starting to learn a lot more about turtles using upland habitats. And here's what we now think. About 500 meters is what turtles need to be able to thrive. Now that doesn't mean survive, it means thrive. So if you want really prime turtle habitat, you want to make sure all the turtles are surviving, or worse yet, maybe it's listed as endangered and you have to consider what habitat might be impacted in relation to turtles, you're going to have to include 500 meters. Yeah, I know how big that is. It's enormous. Yes, I'm very aware in the consulting world that people want to construct as close to the creek as they can because they want to put in as many houses or roads or Walmarts or whatever as they want to. But we're going to have to consider about 500 meters of habitat. And I'm not saying this just off the top of my own head, because the last paper I wrote on upland habitat used by turtles said something like 60 meters would get you protection of many or most of the nests. That was based on a site that was very small. The service is saying this. This is what the service is saying. So they have developed minimization measures for pond turtles already because they know this thing is going to get listed. They're trying to get on top of this. And this is the number that I saw in their document that they let me review. It's not available for public yet, but I'm giving you the information verbally so you know what's coming. When this thing gets listed, you're going to have to consider the impacts of turtles out to 500 meters. And that's not only nesting, which we'll talk about pretty quick here, but also just estivation, movement, and then access and brumation. So all these little factors that we don't think about very much for turtles are going to come into play because the minimization measures will say 500 meters, at least at this point. And I didn't change it when I read it and reviewed it, neither did anybody else. So this will be brief. Predators and general threats. Predators, I'll start in the upper left. Skunks. We're going to talk a lot about this when we're out talking about nests. So skunks are nest predators. They take probably half of the nests. At least on the site I worked on, they took definitely half the nests. They're the prime predator of turtles that I am aware I'm going to go sort of counterclockwise here. There's a largemouth bass. Fish tend to not eat baby turtles as much as we fear. Now, there is a paper out there that said there's catfish that eat turtles, and a turtle was found in a largemouth bass. But lots and lots of work on the East Coast says that the turtles that occur there, and there's 14 species of turtles on the East Coast where largemouth bass are native, are really not preyed upon by bass. So probably not a huge impact, but doesn't mean that they aren't an impact. They do a little bit of feeding on them for sure. Certainly ground predators like coyote are going to eat them when they can. Otters are probably number 2 in terms of predators for turtles. So skunks get them when they nest, otters get them when they're in the water, coyotes get them when they're going between the land and the water. Raccoons will definitely eat little turtles. They're not really big on the big turtles. By that I mean they don't have the jaw strength to break through the carapace like an otter might, but they're going to eat the little turtles for sure. But baby turtles are eaten by everything. And then I put a person in here with a trap because turtles are still trapped and eaten for food. If you look at some of the live food markets, turtles are still being sold. Now, you're not supposed to do it, obviously, but it's still happening. Turtle poaching does occur in the Delta quite a bit. So I just put that in there. People also just still catch them and keep them as pets. So that's not going to be very helpful if you're a turtle. And then the big threat right now for small turtles, even more so than raccoons, is bullfrogs. So bullfrogs definitely eat turtles. We've shot and killed lots of bullfrogs, opened them up, found turtles inside. So if you are very, very pro-turtle, you're going to have to get on the bandwagon of bullfrog removal. It's not pretty, it's not fun, but it's definitely very, very effective. Another threat is development. Not just the development because of, it's covering all the dirt and the turtles have nowhere to go, but because of the barriers that development provides. So a curb, just a concrete curb, can be a barrier, maybe not to adult turtles, but to small turtles for sure. The other thing that we don't see in this picture very clearly is sewer grates, so stormwater drains. Turtle's going to hit the curb, falls onto the street, it hits a curb, trying to get out, can't get out, walks along the curb, goes down the sewer grate, and then gets transported somewhere else, probably to a concrete channelized ditch that's going to take it out in the ocean. It's not going to do very well there. And then roadways are not so good for turtles. It's really an emerging threat. We seem to want to bisect aquatic habitat from its upland habitat component by putting a road in. Not sure why these roads get planned that way, but it does happen quite a bit. And then we don't put permanent barriers to keep them off the road. We're going to need to start doing this more and more. Turtles are not pretty when they're run over. It's very, very unsettling to see the inside of a turtle. Some rule in my head that says you're not supposed to see the inside of a turtle. But they get hit by cars quite frequently. They're not very fast. People don't seem to avoid them. And this is the time of year when this happens, from about mid-May to about mid-July, when the females are looking for nesting sites. They'll just get hit, and that's typically the end of the turtle. Although not always, but typically. And then another threat, a final threat in this group, is non-native competitors. And by competitors, I really mean competitors for basking sites. Not for nesting sites necessarily, although these will certainly use the same nesting area. But they compete for basking sites and outcompete our pond turtle, mostly because most of the non-natives are bigger than our pond turtle and more assertive than our pond turtle. And in that way, they push pond turtles off of basking sites, which makes pond turtles more susceptible to lots of different things, shell rot, algal and fungal diseases, and lots of other things too. And they just need to be warmed up by basking, and they don't get that opportunity when there are lots of competitors. This is kind of typical. In this photo, there's one pond turtle, and all of the rest are non-native. And the pond turtle is on the very left. It's not the last turtle, but it's second to last, and it's looking upward to the left corner. All these others are non-native turtles, mostly painted turtles and sliders. And you get enough of the non-native competitors, and they just shove off all the pond turtles. So I put this in here, sympatric species, because I think we tend to have to manage sites for the idea that there's an endangered or threatened species, and then how do we deal with the site based on the endangered species? But there might be multiple versions of that. And so by that I mean this is kind of the typical endangered threatened species component that you would see with pond turtle. Giant garter snake in the upper left, San Francisco garter snake in the middle on the top, two-striped garter snake. They all co-occur with pond turtles, one species or the other. And then the lower group, red-legged frog, very common with pond turtles. Tiger salamander, really, really common. They seem to appreciate the same habitat. Foothill yellow-legged frog, very commonly found with pond turtles. So when you're dealing with pond turtles, you're probably dealing with one or more of these other species, in some cases 2 or 3 of these species. You can find sites where 3 or 4 of these species can all co-occur, and you're going to have to manage for that. Now with the new minimization measures having you consider 500 meters of upland habitat, you're going to be considering many more of these species as well along with it. So if we do actually use the finalized version of those minimization measures at 500 meters, we're going to actually be protecting many more of these other species as well. And I just made a quick list just to kind of give you some idea. It won't always be turtle that you're worried about. It's going to be lots of other things. So northern red-legged frog, northern leopard frog, cascade frog, lots of frogs, western spadefoot, long-toed salamander, giant salamander, a couple of newts. And then I remind you that northwestern and southwestern pond turtle down here at the very bottom are sympatric in some areas. So both species can occur together. And again, if you're making it into the field with us, you'll be able to see that. So behavior and reproduction, we're going to talk about this kind of briefly. And then after this, we'll maybe take a 5-minute break or so just to get me some water and maybe give you guys a chance to send a few texts. So this turtle is going to be a turtle that we see basking. It's going to have to climb out of the water and bask. So you can see a couple of turtles on this tree here. They're going to find any sort of substrate they can to bask on, and this includes each other. They'll stack on top of each other. One of the very, very limiting factors for turtles in suitable habitat is basking sites. So if they can't bask on logs or rocks that are in the water, they'll bask on a floating tire or a dead cow or whatever is in the water. They're going to bask on. They don't really care. If there's nothing in the water that they can bask on, they're going to bask on the bank. That's a secondary basking site. They don't prefer that because they're more likely to be predated on the edge of a bank. So we promote the idea that if you put in some basking material, you're probably going to promote or increase suitability of habitat for turtles. Turtles also bask in the water. So I'm just standing on a little bridge looking straight down. There's this turtle just sitting right on the algae and the vegetation. It turned out it was also feeding in there, but it's doing what we call surface basking. This is very common with smaller turtles. This is quite a small turtle. It would easily fit just like 3 or 4 of this size turtle would fit in your hand. So pretty small young turtle, just surface basking. It's very hard to identify these turtles when they're surface basking because all you see is kind of a shell shape and maybe a head pops up every now and then. You don't really get all the features you need. Certainly you're never going to be able to know northwestern from southwestern. You can't even see under the edge of it. But sometimes you're going to have to just come back a second time or maybe even trap. Now turtle feeding, turtles will feed on lots of live animals. This turtle was photographed by Brian Hubbs, who was working, I think he was in San Benito County at the time. He saw this turtle grab and swim away with a crayfish. I think it's pretty cool because crayfish are not always friendly to native wildlife. The other interesting thing I saw about this photo, and he didn't notice or think about it, was the back end of the turtle is covered in sort of this sort of mushy, mossy, kind of broken down algae look. This happens quite commonly when they're outcompeted for basking sites. So the turtle will be basking like just the head out and the upper portion of the shell is out, and the rest of it is in the water, and it builds up an algae layer, and eventually just causes the turtle some problem because it doesn't dry up and and it promotes to a lack of health of the turtle. And that's just sort of a tangent, which is typical for me. The point is that I'm talking about turtle feeding here. Turtles feed in the water, only in the water, and that's why this has grabbed this crayfish from underneath the surface. So they're also going to eat fish. I've seen them eating tiger salamanders. I saw a toad going down a creek, just sort of bobbing like a cork. I went over, grabbed the toad, pulled it up, and there was a turtle hanging from it. They have no problem predating live animals, so they will eat things that are alive. But then I put this photo of this duck, dead duck in the water. This was a sort of post-hunting season. Lots of ducks end up succumbing to poor aim from hunters. And turtles just turn this into turtle protein very quickly. If any of you know Jeff Wilcox, he's got a pond on his ranch, and late in the summer, the food resources really get depleted. And if he is able to collect a pig from his site, which he does regularly, he'll throw chunks of the pig in the pond, and the turtles come up like little piranha and just feed on the dead pig. Carrion is an important part of turtles' natural history, and feeding on it is the way we trap turtles. We use bait that is essentially a dead animal, and they come in and feed on that. And then broadly speaking, turtles, this is kind of remind me to tell you, turtles use the upland quite a bit, often at night, but not always at night. Often, certainly they're going to use the upland for basking, but they're going to move across the landscape often at night to move to different sites. So just because we keep focusing on water, which is where they feed, where they seek refuge, where they thermoregulate, we'll find them in and around the upland habitat doing lots of different things in addition to nesting. So here's nesting behavior. I'm going to talk about this in a minute and kind of give us all a break. How about if we take about, it's 9:42, we'll come back at 9:50 and we'll start with this, the pond turtle nesting. So let's take a break for, it's going to be about 9:50, 7-minute break. We'll come right back to this.
Hello, Jeff.
Hey, Andy.
How are you?
I'm good.
How's your mom doing?
She's aging.
Uh,
Hey, thanks for sending those photos over your pond turtle.
oh, no problem. No problem. Yeah, the first time I surveyed the reservoir, my friend, my coworker and I, we did the float tubes, and he observed one, and then a couple of weekends ago, I went out just looking for frogs in my kayak, and I happened to see one there, but my coworkers observed a male and female in the creek further down where there's a couple pools that have formed, which is interesting because that creek has not had water in it for a really long time.
And by long time, how long do you mean?
Probably a couple of years.
Ah, wow, yeah.
Yeah. But it's just a pretty interesting area. I'm hoping to finish my permit stuff up this weekend.
Right.
Uh,
The permit process is never fun or easy, but it's good to just keep pushing forward.
yeah, we have I've been doing a lot of spadefoot survey stuff too on the aqueduct. And I've found like 4 or 5 spots where you wouldn't think that there would be a spadefoot, but we found them. Tadpoles, right next to like a fallow ag field, just like a drainage that the farmer created. And then so I caught a couple tadpoles, then I went back a couple weeks later and there happened to be quite a few bullfrogs there. So I think they had a nice meal on the spadefoots.
Yeah, unfortunately, spadefoot they're so slow that they're gonna really be predated by bullfrogs. That's just a terrible situation.
Yeah, they have there's other place too. There was just a farm road, about 2 or 3 inches of water, and I found a couple really small spadefoot tadpoles, but they didn't make it right up.
So we're gonna get started here pretty quick, but Andy and I know each other. I'm sure Heidi's in the background there too. And- Hi, Heidi. We're just catching up on a few things, but we'll get started here. And I'm certainly more than happy to be open to talking about anything you guys want to talk about at the end of our presentation. But Andy sent me an email that I thought was interesting, so just wanted to comment about that. So we'll get started here again. And so what I was really just sort of going through and trying to go over is the kind of the natural history context. And so we talked about predators and threats and habitat, and then started moving more into feeding. And then where I was heading here was turtles can be active day or night. Typically, the smaller the turtle, the more likely it is to be active at night. I think coincidentally, I was just talking to Andy about his turtle photos that he sent me. I'm pretty sure they were nighttime photos. So that's pretty interesting to me. We know very, very little about turtle behavior at night, and I think that it's wide open for somebody to study, and I think would be fascinating. We'll definitely be talking about that in the field. So here's a turtle I just stumbled across at night one time. He was just wandering through the uplands. Um, why it was wandering through the uplands, I did understand, and I'll tell you about that as I get to a different slide. But turtles are active in the uplands quite a bit more than I think we realize, and that's why the service is trying to encompass a 500-meter zone for us to consider turtle activity. So just sort of finishing off the feeding predators kind of natural history aspect, and then just reminding you that even if the turtles are out, if they're in the upland, they're not feeding. They're just going to be fasting, and that may just be for a few hours or it might be for several months. So moving on here, turtles definitely use the upland for nesting. So this is an actual nesting turtle. It's got a couple of funny blotches on its left side there. That's a telemetry unit that used to be on its back. We put telemetry units on lots and lots of turtles and watched what they did, and I'll talk about some of those results in a little while. But turtles will be doing this kind of activity this time of year, which is why we're picking this time of year to do the workshop. And the upland habitat is absolutely critical for them. They have to get either far away from the water if it's a potentially flooded area, or they get high up on a hill or a slope. Tends not to matter what slope aspect it is as much as people believe. We'll talk about all those details in the field, but upland habitat becomes really important. I talked so much about aquatic habitat, I just want to remind you upland habitat matters too. Then here's a little tiny post-emergent turtle, and I'm going to remind you of that kind of phrasing frequently, especially in the field. So a hatchling turtle is going to come, a hatchling turtle occurs in August, and a post-emergent turtle comes out of the ground, out of the nest in February or March, and that's, you can see this turtle's dirty, just came out of its nest. So that's a post-emergent turtle, not a hatchling. You can just make it easier and call it a neonate, so it's a young turtle. They use the upland, and I'll be very specific about how they use the upland as we move along through this presentation. But upland habitat and aquatic habitat, both super important for turtles. Yeah, they need the aquatic habitat for most of their life, but they need the upland habitat for the critical aspects of their life. Estivation, brumation, nesting, and migration and movement. Without the upland habitat, you don't have habitat. So we'll go through kind of a brief phenology, like the timing of how turtles function over the course of a year, and I'll track it along the bottom with a little calendar so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about. So given that we're looking at just sort of a season, turtles tend to be inactive during the winter, and as the season progresses towards spring, around late February, certainly into March, turtles become very active. They're more active when it's sunny out, but they'll be active even when it's sort of what we consider gloomy, sort of cloudy. They are mating this time of year, so they're mating very late February, mostly through March, and a little bit into April. Mating occurs entirely in the water. So you'll see you won't see the female, she'll be underwater, and the male will be on top of her, and they'll be mating in the water. And if the female's lucky, occasionally she'll come up for a breath of air. The male, as you might guess, doesn't typically care about that piece as long as he does what he needs to do. So what it'll look like is there'll be a single turtle, you'll see the male, and he'll seem to be wobbling in the water like he can't swim very well. But that's because he's on top of a female and pushing her down and trying to mate. So that occurs typically in the spring, typically before about mid-April. But it can occur all the way into maybe the end of April as well. So as we move forward here, so about this time of year, so starting in maybe mid-May, the females primarily will come out of the water and they'll start looking around for a nesting site. That doesn't mean they're nesting, it just means they're looking around. So about mid-May, we'll start seeing females like crossing roads or trails, or you'll see them far away from water and you think, oh, this turtle got lost. This is very, very common with the public. They'll pick up a turtle, take it to a rescue center, but it was just a female looking around for a nesting site. She'll find a nesting site eventually, usually after 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 trips into the uplands, maybe more, it just depends. And at that time, she'll construct a nest, lay her eggs, and then make it her way back to the water. I'll give you a lot more detail about that in a minute, and certainly more in the field. But this is still just the timing of the year. So the female's going to make her nest by pressing herself into the edge of a shrub or some grasses or some little piece of cover. So the idea you want to think about is the female has come up, she's found sort of an open patch where it's a little bit sunny. She sees a little patch of grass or sprig of grass, finds a little bare patch in it, and then pushes her way into it to find a little bit of cover in there. The cover is really for her, it's not for the eggs at all. and then she'll start making her nest at that moment. So if the female nested, and that previous photo was this turtle is nesting, so that big red thing is a telemetry unit. It's a GPS telemetry unit. So we knew where she was, and she nested. And if we pick the turtle up and move it to the side, this is what we would see. That's her nest. We kind of stopped this before she finished, meaning she dug a hole, laid her eggs, made the hole, we call it a nest plug. So she made a plug with her back legs, pushed it into the nest hole, packed it down in there. You can see it looks like somebody just sort of patted that mud down tight. And the final step that we didn't let her do was she reaches out with her back legs, grabs some vegetation, and smashes that into the mud and presses it down, and effectively camouflages the nest. The only thing you would see is this sort of damp spot if you push the grass away. And we knew the process, so we wanted the photo and we did this. Her nest is perfectly fine. We protected it after we pulled her off of it. But what I will say over and over when we're in the field is we found this nest because we found the female nesting. We would otherwise have never found this nest, even after doing 12 years of this work. Nests are incredibly cryptic. And if you wait an hour or two after she nested, you'll never find it. The only way you find it is if a skunk found it first. So here's a nest on a female came up, nested here, got spooked in the process of laying eggs and just took off. Because in the end, her eggs are not very valuable, she is. So we're still looking at the nesting season. So eggs are underground during June, July, August, depending on when she made her nest. Around August, these little turtles will hatch in the nest and stay underground in the nest. So what you're imagining is there's a little spherical nest chamber in the ground about, I think Kayla's got some background noise. There's a little nest chamber in the ground about 3 inches below the surface, maybe 2 inches below the surface. And they're hatching underground. And that all those little turtles will stay right in that little nest chamber, moving around very slowly, not doing very much. Over time, what they end up doing is kind of crushing their little eggshells into the dirt. You'll never find them again. And they stay in that nest. As they're in the nest, they're moving up against the top of the nest and wearing the roof of the nest out until eventually they wear it out to the surface, and there will be a little hole, which I'll show you in a couple of minutes here. And eventually they just push their way right out. So here's a nest that we knew existed. This was in February. It sort of passed the time where we thought they should be emerging, and we thought maybe it got predated underground, which does happen. So gophers come in, will eat the nestlings, and then take off. So we dug up the nest, and here are all these little, I don't even know, they're just neonates. Because they haven't emerged, so they're not post-emergent. They've hatched 5 months ago, so they're not hatchlings. But in this nest, you can see a turtle there on the right side of the little hole. To the left of it is an egg, and to the left of that egg is another egg, and then there's another turtle kind of pressed in there. So lots of nests have maybe 6 to 8 eggs, and half to all of them will hatch. Some of them don't hatch. They weren't fertilized, or they just got crushed when the female was making the nest cap. In this case, we're monitoring nests. We know what time these should be hatching. We just opened it up, and this is what a nest chamber looks like. Little turtles just moving around in the mud. And it is muddy because it's February, so it had been raining for months. And they're wearing out their nest chamber roof and eventually going to just pop right out. So this is now sort of spring, so you're in the following spring, so we've made it through the entire year, and then the hatchlings emerge and start making their way to aquatic sites. So this typically happens in very, very late February, but March and April. And so I put this white line in the little calendar reminding you that a nest is probably produced in June, and then these nestlings stay underground all the way till March or April of the following year. So essentially there's a nest, once there's a nest in the ground, it's there about 9 months out of the year. So these little nestlings come out and then they have to make their way to the water so that they can begin to feed on their own. Now I put this other photo in there because what you often see this time of year, and most of the year, is a predated nest. So that's a photo of a predated nest where a skunk came along, dug out the nest, ate whatever the contents of the eggs were, whether it's just raw yolk and other materials, or the actual turtle itself. The skunks don't care; they're going to eat it all. So the predated nest is something you see during the same time of year that the turtles are emerging. So we'll probably see predated nests when we go into the field. So these little hatchlings, and I say hatchlings, but that's because I knew the timing of this. So we're just going to call these neonates for the sake of argument, are very tiny. So that's a quarter. A quarter is 1 inch. So the turtle is essentially about 1 inch. Now, if you think about the size of that just being on the ground, it's not easy to find something that's green, that's walking around in green stuff on the ground when you're also probably trying to text or take notes or watching your GPS or whatever. So these are very, very, very hard to find. Now, on the right side, you can see I flipped the turtle over and you're looking at the plastron. There's this little tiny belly button that I kind of half mentioned when we were talking about males versus females. So we know that this is a neonate because it's still got that connection to effectively what is its food that was in the egg. But that little spot, when they hatch out of the egg, it looks more like a jelly bean attached to its belly, and then it's feeding off of that in the nest, which is how they stay underground for about 5 months. They're not feeding at all, they're just absorbing those nutrients. So very, very hard to find. If you are writing a document and you say, oh, we're going to do ground disturbance around this creek during maybe February and March because we want to beat the nesting bird season, these are what you're going to have to go look for, and you're just not going to find them. They're just too hard to find, especially when they haven't even made it to the water. So here's a site that we will visit. It's going to look very, very different than this, but the number that I've put here on the right side of this slide is to say there's a red dot, and that is where a nest was. And so a post-emergent turtle, so this is now February, a post-emergent turtle comes out of the nest and starts to make its way to the water. Now, the distance between the nest and the water was about 30 feet, 10 meters, not very far. So it seems like it could probably make it there in a day, but that's not the way these things work. So this little tiny turtle will come out, it'll make its way maybe 2 or 3 feet, find a little piece of grass, a patch of grass or some leaf litter or duff, push its way under that and stay there for a day. And then another day will come and it'll make another movement. And you know, if it hits a stone, it'll make a turn, and we don't know which way that's going to go. And it might find a little hole in the ground and it goes in there and it waits another day. And then it does this over and over and over and over and over until it finally makes it into the water. And for little tiny neonates, it typically takes a week to 2 weeks to get to the water, even when they're close. But if you imagine some nests that are 200-300 meters from the water, and some are, not all of them, but a minority are, the average being maybe 60 meters. Let's use that as a good example. 60 meters from the water, this illustration I show you is 10, it takes almost a week. 60 meters, it's going to take a couple of weeks at least. Most of these turtles don't make it to the water. They get eaten by snakes, skunks, raccoons, possums, crows, jays, everything. This is the perilous time for turtles. It's also perilous because this is a time where we start to think about things like, oh, the beginning of the field season is happening. You know, it's March. The turtles are moving during the beginning of our field season. We're getting out there, projects are moving along, and we're not thinking about turtles being in the habitat that just might be sitting in a little patch of grass that we're walking over. Now, we walk over it, we don't think much about that, but it might have an impact on an individual turtle. But if you're driving equipment over it, including your own vehicles, you're going to be squishing turtles if you're within 60 meters of the water. And that's just the average distance that nests are. That doesn't mean it's, that encompasses, a whole standard deviation or anything like that. So all this area around turtle nests in this time of year, February, March, and part of April, the very early part of April, is really the most sensitive time for these little turtles to get to water, and is the most likely time they're going to die, or just get trapped by anything. I mean, if you're constructing, I have an example of like a solar array. They put in a solar array, but they had to put in these cables to connect it to the power system. So they dig a long ditch that's about 1/4 of a mile long from their solar array to a power tower, and that is just a huge pitfall trap for turtles. And it's going to collect every single one of them that is between its nest site and an aquatic site. So you have to keep all these kinds of things in mind, and this is why the service is saying we're going to make you consider impacts up to 500 meters away. Because any kind of impact, I mean, you could throw a shoe on this trail and leave it there, and that's an impact to a turtle because now it's blocking its pathway. A little tiny turtle cannot climb over very much. And, even a cattle footprint might entrap a turtle. They're really good at climbing, but it's going to slow them down, and then a predator can easily find them. So very, very tricky time of life for them. And just as a reminder, this is what they look like. So this is my actual hand. There's 3 turtles in it. I think we had about 8 turtles this one day. Very, very difficult to find. You will be, I'm going to encourage you never to write in a document, we're going to do neonate turtle surveys, and we'll move every turtle we find, and that'll keep them out of harm's way. That's just not the way to do it. You're going to have to say, if we're going to do ground disturbing during the time neonate turtles are moving, we're going to kill all the turtles. And by that, you have to calculate out what that's going to be. So the formula we use is number of females times 1.6, which is the average number of clutches they lay, times 6.5, which is the average number of eggs they lay. So nests they make, eggs they lay, and then your number becomes, like if you have 100 females, you're going to have 700 neonates. Okay, if you're going to do ground disturbing activity during February, March, and April, early April, you're going to kill probably 700 turtles. And if the thing is listed, you're probably not going to get a permit for that. So you have to consider these kinds of things. You really can't say, we're going to do a neonate survey. Nobody does them, nobody should, nobody could. Maybe dogs could, because these turtles actually stink. They smell like a rotting carcass, which is a very bad thing if you're a little turtle, because then any mammal's going to pick you up and eat you. And that's because their nest is kind of sticky and they just pick up that smell. So yeah, they smell bad. Yeah, they're going to get eaten. Even if predators got 80% of them, we're still going to kill a bunch. So very, very sensitive time for turtles. And we'll keep talking about that.
Jeff, I have a question.
Yeah.
So do all neonates overwinter in the nest, or do some hatch in like August, September?
Yeah. So we know that some in Southern California will hatch in the summer and then emerge in the summer, but we don't know where that line is. So if you're south of Santa Barbara County, you're probably in that zone where most of the nests are going to emerge in the summer, but not all, most of them. North of that, predominantly they're going to overwinter, and as you get to the Bay Area and north, they're all going to overwinter. And we don't know much about the foothills. We imagine that they're overwintering, but this is not something that anybody has studied. So the position of the service will be that they're all overwintering unless proven otherwise. And since you can't prove that ever, because there's always going to be a proportion that can overwinter, maybe it's in a little shady spot, and then they just overwinter there because it's cooler. You're up against turtles in the ground, which is tough. Did that help you or hurt you?
No, it helps.
Okay.
Because I guess I keep box turtles, and some overwinter and some are hatching in the summer, so I
Yeah.
was kind of putting the same aspects on the Western pond turtles, but it sounds like who knows, and probably not. So,
Yeah, it's really tricky because we've not spent enough time studying this animal, and here it is going to be listed. And now we're going to be up against these limitations that are excessive, but also important. So it's really going to be a tough thing. And so we have a little list of things that, like, we need data collected on these things. And we've sent that out to lots of professors who have students that do turtle work. But, it's still years away from us getting those data. Where's the line where they stop overwintering in the nest? Or is there? Maybe there isn't one. There probably isn't one, because where they put the nest is going to make a huge difference. And if the thing is endangered, I mean, if the southwestern pond turtle gets to be endangered, they're not going to allow you to disturb a single nest, because you're going to kill 8 turtles on average. Yeah, it's not going to be easy. But a
Thank
great,
you.
Question?
yeah.
I was just curious the average depth of a nest, and even when it's all underground and encased, are we compacting it when we drive over it, walk over it, etc.?
Yeah, those are super good questions. So the average depth of a nest is going to be about 2 to 3 inches below the surface, and then you hit the beginning of the nest. Then the nest probably goes down to about 6 inches or so. It depends on the size of the female, because the length of her back legs dictates the depth of the nest. So she'll put it as deep as she can, as far down as she can go, she'll go, and then she'll lay her eggs and then pack a little mud plug on that. Now, once the plug dries, and that takes about a day or two, that thing's solid. You can walk over it. You could drive over it. And typically those things are pretty darn resilient to that kind of activity. But if you drag a scraper over it of any kind, you're doing ground disturbance, you're going to tear the plug right out, and the neonates will either be exposed. If the eggs are in there, they'll be dried out and desiccated and die. So think about, and we'll talk about this in a minute, if a nest is in the ground, say an early nest is May 15th, and it stays till February 15th, that's the time you can't do ground disturbance without disturbing a nest, because you're not going to find them to be able to dig them up and move them. And this poses a huge problem that we'll talk about in the field and also as we move forward here. But these things become really quite problematic. But once they've laid their eggs and packed the nest and it's dried, so say early July, every single nest is solidified and is going to be fine. And you can drive a vehicle over it. And we've done this not purposefully, but just by the way life works at some sites. You just drive all the time, and they seem to be just fine. The design of a turtle nest is really meant to be in the presence of ungulates. So, a bison or an elk or something walks over a turtle nest, the design works great. It works well.
Okay, so that's going to be the magic window for activities, huh?
Yeah,
Potentially.
I'll be pointing out the magic window. I have a chart that's going to just be offensive.
Thank you.
So just to kind of give you some idea, some background, lots of this information comes from firsthand experience in reading lots of documents, but we did a lot of work on turtle nesting. Here's a female that we put a telemetry unit on. Again, this is a GPS unit. So in these kinds of units, they have a VHF and a UHF unit inside. And that means you can use the antenna, the old Yagi style antenna, or you can just download the points that are generated by the GPS unit. To use these kinds of units takes a big turtle because the units are pretty big. And they also don't give you a long window, but the window is wide enough to get the entire nesting season. So we put lots of these on turtles, put them on a very finite site, meaning a site that had a fence around it, so we knew where the turtles could and could not go. And we followed them for years and tried to figure out, could you, say, go out there in maybe fall, put a bunch of units on a bunch of females. The timer is set that it starts to record data in April, and then figure out where they nested and protect their nests. Could we do it in that way? So with GPS units, you could set a clock inside that unit where you put the unit on them when they're still very active in the fall, let that thing sleep all winter long, and then the nesting season starts and they're ready to go and they nest. That was our question, and here are our answers. So that female, that was white, number 61. So we put a unit on her. You could see two kind of points where she spent a lot of time just either basking or doing whatever she's doing. We don't know exactly what she was doing, but our unit picked up a location every single hour for whatever number of weeks we had. We got 741 points on her, and that's what all these are. And the general goal was to say, well, the GPS units tell us where she nested. So we had to look at all the spots where she was spending time in the upland and figure out if that was a nesting site. So for us, that gave us these little dots. So we had 6 spots where we were visiting, and we were trying to figure out, okay, did she nest here? Well, we don't really know because she was only there about an hour, and a nest takes usually 3 to 4 to 5 hours. Doesn't mean she didn't nest in one of those spots. It just meant we had to visit them, get on our hands and knees, start pushing the grass around, look for whatever sign we could find that would suggest she made a nest, and then protect that spot. The problem with this is the nests are super cryptic. And even if you're giving me a dot on the ground, and the GPS unit was, I think, plus or minus 2 meters. So we had essentially a 4-meter area that we were looking at. We couldn't find a single nest ever in all the years we did it. We tried and tried and tried and tried and tried. So the GPS units cost like, I don't know, I think they were $3,000. And the software cost another couple of thousand. And, you know, we spent lots and lots of money. I think we spent about $60,000 trying to find nests this way, and found 0 on lots of turtles. We have, you know, this is white. We had purple, green, yellow, black, blue. All these different turtles were out there doing the same thing. And we have maps that show them doing whatever they're doing. We couldn't figure it out, not from these units. And people still try this, and it just is not going to work for you. Because even if she only went to the upland once, and you went out there and you're on your hands and knees pushing apart every single bed of grass, trying to find a plug in the ground, you might find one nest from one animal. And we've had a student find one. But that's only one. And we had 62 female turtles at this site. So what are we doing? We're spending a lot of money and a lot of time and finding nothing. So if we had 62 females, we probably roughly had about 100 nests, because some of them have 2 clutches, some of them have 1, and we ended up with 1 nest out of about 100. And that was over the course of 6 years of doing the telemetry. So potential for 600 nests, we found 1, this technique. So wasn't the best technique, but I assure you, lots of people are still doing it. Lots of people. And then they say, oh, this is where the nest was. We're going to protect this area. And that's not doing anything. So here's what we actually did. Got out there and looked around. I give you a little bit of sigh because this was a lot of work. So the way this happened is you go out to the site about 2 in the afternoon. You walk around until you think you found a turtle that might be coming out of the water. You find a little hiding spot and you watch the turtle come out of the water, find a nest site. If you know nesting behavior, you know every single step and stage of the nesting. And if she completes a nest and starts to move away from it, you run like hell after her, grab the turtle, but more importantly, try to figure out where she came from, because while you're running, she sees you and she starts running. And now she's 3 meters from her nest spot, and now you got to still find that nest. Luckily, it's wet. So you're on your hands and knees and you're pushing through the grass for hour to hour and a half, and you find a little wet spot and you're like, oh, thank God I found the nest. So you protect the nest, put a fence around it, let the female go. Now you have a nest. Now you go right back and do the same thing again, because there might be 2 or 3 turtles nesting that day. And you do that from May 15th to July 5th. And if you do that and you're there every day, you'll probably find 50% of the nests. And I say 50 because some of these females are going to come out in the morning, but it's a very small proportion. Some are going to watch you and go somewhere else, and then some are going to just be hiding somewhere you're not looking. So you're finding 50% of the nests, you protect those. You're going to find the rest of them because the skunks will find them, and you'll find a predated nest. And there'll be a little proportion, just some small number, 4, 5, 6, 7 nests maybe that you never found, the skunks never found, but you're going to find when your ground disturbing happens. And that'll be a painful day. And I'll show you more about that in a minute. So here's the female. I'm watching. She's looking around. That's her behavior, sticking her head up, looking, moves another 10 feet, does the same thing, looks around with her head, just poking around, looking around. If she sees anything disturbing, she runs back to the water and just waits for another day. But in this case, this female came out, looked for a nest, and I had to watch for her. So here she is. She actually made it to another property, got on under a hole in the fence, walked across this road, moved off, made a fence on a property we didn't have access to. Probably got predated, we don't really know. But the point is, you're sitting there watching this turtle move at, 1 mile per hour, and you're just staring at it through your binoculars for half hour to an hour until it finds its little spot. Then it digs its little nest, and you're watching that for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 hours, and then you do the mad dash. And sometimes this is what you see. So you run up there, the female urinated, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to find their nest spot, urinate, dig a little, urinate, dig a little, urinate, dig a little. And that's how they get through really crusty soils. So they'll nest in clay, they nest in silty soils, they nest in hard pack, they nest in whatever they want. It doesn't need to be super friable or sandy or anything like that. You'll see when we get out to this nest site or this field site. Some of this is just really hard packed old silt mud, and they just dig right through it anyway. But this female hit a stone and gave up. And so I'm watching her for 3 hours. She makes the mad dash, I make the mad dash, and I get there and there's this little nest start. That's what we call these, a nest start. Didn't go anywhere. I pick up the female, do all the stuff we're going to do with her, put her back in the water. She's still got eggs. She's going to make a nest. Is it going to be that same day? I'm not sure. Is it going to be tomorrow? Maybe. But we're doing this surveying 7 days a week from May 15th to July 5th. So the arrow is pointing in the direction of her face. So her head is pointed sort of down to the bottom of the slide. And this becomes kind of relevant because when you see where they nest, and you know which direction they're pointing, you get to understand the kind of microhabitat they pick for a nest site. It doesn't mean I can walk along and say, oh, they would pick this, they would pick this. No chance at all. But you do understand that when you do that mad dash, what you're going to start looking for when you're within the meter that she maybe have made a nest in. And you start looking like, oh, here's a little clump of grass, the only one here. I'm going to start looking there first. So here's another nest start. This one was an entire hole. This is my hand, so my finger is probably a ½ inch wide. So the hole's not very big, about an inch. It goes down about 3 to 4 inches, so you can touch the bottom of it. I felt in there, and there was a little root from a plant. And so because there's a root in there, she just stopped digging and walked away. Now, because she made such an effort to make this nest, she used a lot of urine to be digging and softening it and digging and softening it. She'll have to go back to the pond, spend the day drinking, acquiring more liquid, and then maybe make her nest the next day because she's used all her storage of fluids to soften the soil here and can't do it anymore. There's nothing more she can do during that day. So here's that same nest with my finger out of the hole. And so the hole is only about an inch. I mean, with your camera, your phone, you could take a photo all the way in. You see the bottom. There are no eggs in there. But again, you could see the direction she was sitting. So her head is pointed in the direction of the arrow. And she's essentially making kind of 2 lobes here with her back feet, where she's digging the hole with one back foot, pulling it up, and then pushing it away. So there's this little rim of mud that's on the backside of the direction that she's sitting. So her tail would be where the center clump is in that next to the hole, and her 2 back feet are making these sort of open patches. So you know which direction she's pointing. And if you look in the upper right, there's a little leaf there. That's because there's a little shrub right there that she had backed up against, and that seems to be pretty common. So here's this photo I showed you earlier. So this female's pushed her way into this little green patch of salt grass. She doesn't care about all this dead grass. She's going to push that out of the way anyway. Here's her face side, so it's not obvious, so I draw a little face on there. And then she's digging her nest, and I've moved her now. So 4 hours have gone by. I picked her up, moved her to the side, and I'm going to show you exactly where the nest is. There. Now, you should be sighing or rolling your eyes or thinking this guy didn't figure out where the nest is or something similar, because if you think you can find a nest, this is why you can't. Because she's going to make that nest. There's going to be that little wet spot that I showed you in earlier slides. But if you let her do everything she's going to do, she's really going to grab some grass, smash it into the mud, and make effectively like adobe with grass and mud. And then she's going to grab more grass and push it over it and push it around in this sort of like you would do if you're trying to hide something. They're doing exactly the same thing. And when you run up, you don't know if it's in front of her, on which side of her, and you're starting to push grass around and you find that little damp spot. Okay, you scored, but only because she's still there or just left. But if she's gone for a day, you're not finding this nest. The only way you would find it is if a skunk found it first. So here is that nest. I pushed off all that vegetation. Here's that wet spot. There's a plug there. I know where it is. I know which direction she sat. I know all those details because I know turtle nesting. But without me pushing that away, there's no way to find this. Literally no way to find this. Now, we tend to quickly say, well, we can use the turtle nest sniffing dogs. Yeah, you can. But remember, the female's coming up and she's going to squirt a little urine on the ground, dig a little. Oh, that's too hard. Move 5 more feet, squirt a little, dig a little. Oh, there's a root. Oh, move a little. And she's doing this in little pieces that you're not even seeing as you're watching her. So we were doing this with some folks that were trying to train their dog, and you might have 200 flags out there where the dog has marked, oh, I think there's a turtle nest here. And the dog's not lying. The dog smelled turtle pee. And you have 200 flags in an area that's 10 meters by 10 meters. And of the 200 flags, one is a nest, and you don't know which. So what do? We just say, oh, give up on the dog. Dog's not wrong. Dog is smelling turtle urine everywhere. But we can't tell anything from that because the turtle just urinated everywhere. And you can't tell a dog, well, only tell me where there's really intense urine smell. It's not going to pull that off. So that's not very effective. Maybe the dogs are helpful in February when the nestlings are going to emerge and they can detect that even underground. But by then, it might be too late anyway. So the direction of the female is in the direction of the arrow. That stuff really becomes pretty critical when you learn turtle nesting. Here's that photo I used earlier, and I'm using it again for a reason. Because this is now at night, because since most turtles start to nest at night, late in the afternoon, the nesting occurs into the night, and you're often there at night. So she nested for sure. We knew she nested, and that's because this little muddy rim on the back of her shell is telling me she was pressed up against some section of dirt. She was digging with her feet, and that mud got accumulated on her shell. So this is a turtle that nested. It doesn't mean it's a turtle that laid eggs. It's a turtle that nested. So she made a nest and left, and the nest probably was complete just based on that amount of mud. But if we're walking down a trail and found a turtle like this and found mud on it, all we know is she nested. We don't know if she laid eggs. And that's because turtles will literally make an entire nest, not lay any eggs in it, pack the thing back, do the camouflage treatment, and walk away. And that, we believe, is a way to reduce predation. So if they make enough of those, what we call phantom nests, they're just empty nests, predators will spend lots of time digging up empty nests and eventually not find a real nest. They just kind of give up because they're wasting a lot of time. So turtles engage in this behavior, and you know it nested, but you don't know if it laid eggs. So when you do find a nest, and we do occasionally, usually following the females, not using telemetry, We put these little cages on top of them. It has to have a big apron over it because skunks will just dig right under. We drive these enormous nails into them with big washers because skunks and other animals try to peel them up. And this little cage looks essentially like a hat. So there's a section in the center about 1 foot by 1 foot that's raised up off the ground about 3 inches, and it has a bigger mesh screen there so that when the turtles actually emerge, they can walk away and go into the aquatic habitat without us being there because we don't know when they're going to emerge. So we're putting these on the ground in June, and they stay on the ground until February or March. And that's a protected nest. And we don't need to build like, big orange fencing all around it, unless you're going to have lots of traffic going through here. As long as you keep people off of this, the nest is protected. And this is very, very effective for protecting a nest when you find one. But when you find one, it's kind of underlined in italics and bold, because that's not going to be very common. So you have to remember time has an impact on these things. So springtime comes, or winter at least, and the vegetation starts to grow. You have to weed these things. Otherwise, the turtles are not going to be able to get out. So you pull all those nails out, pull the nest guard box off, you weed underneath that area, and you put the whole thing right back. Being very careful not to drive any of these nails toward the center of this little center box, because that's where the nest is. And even though we're protecting these nests, we found them ourselves, we protected them. I don't know, I couldn't put like a pinpoint on the nest. It's in there, plus or minus a few inches, so that's why that center box is about 1 foot, to give a lot of area in case the turtles emerge in some other spot. We don't know what's going to happen. And then keep in mind, you can do all of this and still get underground predation by gophers. Yeah, they're supposed to be vegetarians, but they're not. They will go underground, find a nest, and eat the little nestlings or eggs. So here's looking through the top. Let me just kind of go back here. So you see the top little center box. Here's looking through the top, and you see a little tiny pinhole right there. That little pinhole is really a wear mark. So the nest is in there. I know it's in there because we have like part A, B, C, D, E here. So the turtles have been moving underground for months now, for 5 months. This is now the very end of February. And they've moved around so much that they've worn the top of the nest to the point where a few of the little pieces of clay or dirt or mud or whatever have fallen out, and there's a little tiny hole here. It looks like a breathing hole, but they don't need that. They're breathing through cracks in the soil or little tiny air spaces in the soil. They don't need very much oxygen. But this is telling me, okay, there's an active nest here, the eggs hatched, and they're going to emerge within about 2 weeks. If you see this little hole, we just call it for shorthand a breathing hole, even though it's not. If you see this hole, you're going to get emergence in about 2 weeks. And emergence in 2 weeks means maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 days, maybe in 14 days. And they don't all just like pile out like sea turtles. Like one will push its way out, and that hole won't look too much bigger. It'll just press its way through, and it'll find some little piece of debris right next to your cage. And so we'll put cover boards around these little these cages and check them every day. And there might be little neonates underneath them if you're lucky. But they don't always use those either because they don't know what they're looking for. They're just wandering. So here's a turtle about to emerge. I've pulled the cage top off now, and it's going to push its way right through this hole. And this is really maybe the size of like my finger. It's very hard to find these unless you know exactly where you're looking, even when you know where the nest is. So you're definitely not going to find this just hiking around. Your dog might, but you're not. And your dog might because these things stink badly. But that's also why they get predated at this stage as well. So again, I used the same photo I used before. We dug up a nest. Here's what you're going to find. These little tiny neonates trying to get out, trying to find their way to some pond. And given just a day or so, this is what they're going to look like. So we found these outside of the nest. So they've already emerged. They're post-emergent turtles. We found them under some of our cover boards. At this stage, it's still February or late February, early March. It's still raining out, so they get washed off pretty quickly. None of them have eaten. They're all just going to stay the same size until they get to a pond and they start feeding on things like ostracods and copepods and other invertebrates for a while. And here is what you're going to see if you spot one in the water, just hanging around cover, vegetation, etc. This is typically sort of late March, maybe early April. By early April, most of them have made it into the water, but not guaranteed, but most of them. And these are extremely hard to find during the day. They are more active at night, but that just means, you're going to be working at night a lot, just like if you're a frog biologist. So we generally only need to know if there are neonates to say this is a reproductive population. But you can figure that out by just finding juvenile turtles. These are super, super hard to find. So turtles in the uplands, we want to talk about this because I want to emphasize uplands quite a bit. Again, we conducted lots of visual encounter surveys, just sitting around staring. And if you do enough walking and transects around aquatic sites, especially this time of year, you will find turtles in the upland. They will just be parked wherever they want to be parked, thinking about building a nest. Males are also in the upland. Much of the year, they just are moving around looking for better habitat or looking for pools with females. So although the females are out May and June and part of July, they're all out during many parts of the year looking for better habitat, or if their site has dried up, they're going to be up in the upland, pushed under, in this case, pine needles, but up against a log or under a pile of rocks, or other places where they can find cover. And the cover they're looking for is a spot that's thermally stable. So we say they're parked there because we want you to have this idea that they can move around. They're not hibernating, they're not truly estivating, they're really just inactive in the upland, and they do move around. And if they get disturbed, they'll move around a lot. So here's just one of very few tables I tend to use. What this is trying to show you is the maximum number of days turtles have been found in the uplands. So on the left side is going to be the paper that I've cited, and on the right side is going to be the maximum number of days that they recorded a turtle in the upland, and in parentheses that will be the months. So Reese found them in the upland 120 days, Holt about the same, Rathben about 200 days, Bondi 300 days in the upland. That's 10 months of the year. So that was a year where they had a site that dried up and the turtles went into the uplands and it didn't rehydrate for 10 months. And then they came back. Now they were fasting for 10 months, and that's the way it works. Pileoid did a really good paper. If you want to read a paper on upland habitat use, that's the paper to read. 200 days. Zaragoza is the famous one in the Sierra foothills. 330 days, essentially a year, 11 months of the year that they found turtles just not hibernating, but just parked in the uplands waiting for the pond to rehydrate. Now, Alvarez is obviously me. 340 days is a little bit of a kind of a tricky number because I'm going to talk about that in a minute. That is time spent in the field as either nest or adult. So how many days of the year would you find either adult or a nest in the upland? And we're arguing 11 months of the year. So that's why it includes that asterisk saying including nesting. Average, just the average of all the reported ones, 230 days, 7 months in the uplands. So what we're trying to say with this is you drive out to a site you got to do some sort of survey on, you pull up to it, you look out your windshield, the pond is dry, and you say, it's dry, no turtles. And you drive away and you write up, probably no turtles at the site, it's dry. That has to end today. You can't say that anymore. We know 11 months of the year a turtle can starve and still come back to an aquatic site and survive. So starving doesn't mean starving to death, it means just being miserable. But they're not moving, so they're not burning a lot of energy. So just keep this in mind. Dry doesn't mean anything except that it's dry. Doesn't mean anything to a turtle. They've survived in California for millennia. They can survive a few dry periods. And this is really showing you that it is not only common, it's typical. So turtles in the uplands have to be some of those things you think about. You really have to think, okay, the turtle is probably in the uplands half of the year, unless they're at, you know, a sewage treatment site, wastewater treatment site, where it's perennial and it's nutrient rich, and turtles can live there all year and they'll stay in the water. But in aquatic systems like rivers, turtles will leave in the winter as well. So you get a big pulse flow from a big surge of snowmelt. Turtles get out of the water, they move up into the upland, and they park there for a while. They might park under snow. We don't even know that very well, although it has been seen. So it's not just when it dries, it can also be when it's really wet and the water is just too rough, too fast, and they're just parked up in the upland to deal with that. So this sort of tendency to use the upland is something that we want you to think about, because as I show you these charts that are going to follow, turtles are in the upland a lot of the time of year. And not just the adults, but these little neonates. Remember, it takes them a couple of weeks to make it from the nest to the aquatic site. Now, obviously, a very close nest, they might make it there faster, but nests that are very far, they might take much more than 2 weeks, if they even make it. So here's a quick example of like a site that has some nests on it, and this is going to be the site we go visit. There's going to be nests along this site. We don't know exactly where all the nests are, but maybe we will know where some of the nests are, and the turtles have to make that march all the way across. Just dropping back for just a minute. So keep in mind that this is a site that gets managed quite a bit. So they do a lot of weed management. They mow for access, for environmental education. They do security drives. So they drive a vehicle around this site almost daily. So there's lots of activity going on all year long, and we have to manage for those things. So what is the guidance that we offered them? So we'll go over sort of the annual use of uplands. And we're going to start with nests and neonates. So nesting period is going to be essentially mid-May through about mid-July. It's going to vary depending on where you are. It can be later in the year if you're very far north or very high up, or it could be shifted slightly earlier if you're very far south and maybe somewhere very dry. But generally speaking, mid-May to mid-July. Now, this is still all upland habitat use, so now we're going to add on more time. We're going to add the green boxes. This is incubation and hatching time. So most hatching is occurring in August, but the nest is underground. So now we have nesting occurring in mid-May, so the females are in the upland. We have nests in the ground, June, July, and August. But then we have that period where those little neonates are underground for this darker blue period. So we're saying subterranean rest and growth underground. So the nest is underground until February. So now we have turtles in the upland from mid-May to at least late February. Now we have nest emergence in late February and March. Most of it has occurred by the end of March. So then we have to add on to that post-emergent hatchling movement to water. So what we're looking at is mid-May, turtles in the upland, all the way through the year to about mid-April. So neonates are probably not in the upland about mid-April to about mid-May. The adults are mostly in the water, mating and feeding and building up water to build a nest. So here, we talked about this briefly in a question. Here's your window of construction in the uplands where you're not going to impact turtles. Mid-April to mid-May. But keep in mind, this is also nesting bird season. So it's not easy. And I know this, and I sort of look at this and, you know, I do turtle work quite a bit. And I think to myself, how does anybody do anything? So here's our recommendation. You want to do some construction in the uplands, and the thing is now, let's just project forward, it's federally listed. And you want to avoid any take of turtles. You're going to have to construct a fence around your project site during this window, mid-April to mid-May, then you're going to have to wait a year because the previous year they've already nested. You're going to have to wait a year to know that that area that you've just fenced off has nothing in it. Because by then, whatever's in that fenced area has hatched out, has emerged. Theoretically, you will have trapped it in some way, moved it out of your fenced area, and now you're free and clear in your fenced area. If you don't want to fence anything off, or your project, say, starts in August, because that happens all the time, you're going to have to be monitoring 100% of the time and anticipate take. That means you can't say we're less likely or unlikely to impact turtles. You're likely to impact them. You're just going to record the take that you get. So now if we think about the different, if we split sort of this up into different habitat types, and we're going to focus just on adults. So pond activity, the whole year, adults can be in ponds if the pond is wet. The adults primarily, and so this is separating adults only, the adults are going to be in the uplands, even if they're associated with pond habitat, for nesting mid-May to mid-July. If the pond dries, let's just say this is a pond that dries, now they're going to be in the upland to estivate. And remember, they're just sort of parking, so they're moving and scooting and shifting and wandering in the uplands a little bit, usually under a canopy. They're not going to just estivate on the grassland or out on a big gravel bank. They're going to walk through the upland until they find a canopy, get under that where they can find leaf litter and thermally stable microhabitat, and they're going to stay there. Now, if the pond is an extended dry period, they'll shift from estivation to brumation. So now they're in the winter phase of inactivity, and they'll just stay there, and they'll be parked up in the upland, and they're waiting for water to come. And then, so water, these ponds might fill in, say, December during early rain events. Turtles stay in the upland anyway. They might be filled in January, or maybe they filled through December and January, and the pond is wet, but they still stay in the uplands until the pond is very, very full. And that doesn't mean they know how full the pond is. It means they're not going to take a chance to move to a pond that might still be dry. So they wait an extended period and move late in the season, right before mating season. So that tends to be like end of January, most of February. So you may encounter a dry pond that's dry well into winter, then gets wet in December and January, and you go out there and there are no turtles, but the turtles just haven't shown up yet. So here's your window for adults. You're probably free of adults in the winter and early spring in the upland for the most part. So right before the nesting season, from the time they move to the pond to the time of nesting season, most of the adults are in the water. That's because it's mating season. So the little window on top is mostly for nests and nestlings. The big green window here now is pond habitat for adults. So you have a bigger window for adults, but if there's nests in the ground, whether or not you have a bigger window for adults doesn't matter so much. Now, creeks and rivers can be a little bit different because maybe the creek dries at a different time period, but the same sort of general pattern occurs. They might leave the creek when it dries. It might extend well into winter, and they're going to brumate. Sorry, I got a little, I got a chat here question. I'm going to answer this at the end because it's really detailed, and I think it'll be helpful to answer at the end. So I hope that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I'm deciding, but I'll get back to it. So keep in mind that there are windows where there are no adults in the upland, and if you have a population that's not breeding, this is functional. You have a bigger window, but if you have a population that's breeding and you may not even know that, your window is quite small. So we can extend the window into some time periods, but I think you have to be careful when you're doing that because you might find nests the hard way. And this is the hard way. So this is a site where we did not see breeding for many years, and we assumed that this was a non-breeding population. There are lots of those. There was no recruitment, so no juveniles, no young turtles. And we thought, well, we could probably get started with some ground disturbing activity at a time when there would typically be nests in the ground, but we didn't expect nests in the ground because this seemed to be a non-breeding population. And so we drive vehicles out there, and the first vehicle that drives out rolls over a nest, and we didn't realize what was going on, but it kind of breaks up the soil because it was very soft soil, and we saw some sign that well, we should look into that. And we start digging around, and we find these little hatchlings. So this right in the hatchling stage in August, the turtle's coming out of the egg underground, and got unearthed and killed just by driving over it. So remember that as the year progresses, the characteristics of the soil will change, and there are times in certain soil types where the soil is very friable. You shouldn't be driving on it because friable soils are not stable soils, and those nestlings can be unearthed very, very easily. Most nests are dug in very highly compacted soils, so those are quite stable and you can drive over them, but you're gonna have to look at your own site and make these determinations on your own. But the whole nest got dug up just by driving over it at this particular site, which is in a floodplain on the Pajaro River, and the soils were very friable. This is the kind of soil where, as you're walking, your own hiking boot kind of presses the soil away. So not the kind of site you want to do any driving on if you think there are nests in the underground. Obviously, we had to report this to the agencies. Nobody was happy, including us. Here's another one. Here's a site that we will visit on our field site. So this is a little nestling coming out of an egg that was unearthed. And here's the longer version of this story. So we worked at this site 12 years. We figured out where we thought the turtles nested. We're doing a pond turtle enhancement project on these ponds. So the whole project was for enhancing habitat. We constructed our fences in April. We evacuated all the turtles we could. We thought we got them all. We're pretty sure we did. We had telemetry units on most of the females, so we knew where they were anyway. But not all the females, because it's an open population and new females can move in. And one came in, climbed up over our Urtec fence, which I don't recommend for turtles at all. They climb over fencing very, very well. Constructed a nest in our active work area, and they scraped a little section of the levee to rebuild it, and unearthed a whole nest and killed all these little young guys who were, at the very moment of the scraping, hatching out. You can't see it very clearly here, but there's blood on the face of the turtle, and the carapace was severed. Lots of other little hatchlings were exposed on the ground, but this is the one I took a photo of. So this is to say, you have a competent and confident turtle biologist who specialized on this site for 12 years, specialized on this population reproductively for 8 years, figured they knew where they were nesting, did all of the right things, put up the fencing, monitored the fencing, evacuated turtles, monitored the construction. We didn't just have one monitor, we had 4 monitors out on this construction site, and it's only about 20 acres. Did everything like beyond what should have been done or was needed to be done or was asked of us by the agencies, and still killed the turtle nest. Because the turtles have this urge to reproduce, and they're going to go where it is good for them. And by scraping the site clean, they saw that as a better site to make a nest. There's less impact on their digging ability if all the shrubs are removed. There's less shade on a nest site if the shrubs are removed or the grass is removed. And keep in mind that turtles will nest at a site where it is exposed to the sun. They want to have their nest exposed to the sun. And we'll talk about this more in the field, but in the nest chamber, the eggs on the bottom of the nest are going to become male, and the eggs on the top of the nest are going to become female. And the turtle's brain is saying, don't put your nest in shade. They don't know why. They would all become male. And don't put it in just direct sun. Like, you're not going to make a nest in the middle of a Walmart parking lot. They're all going to be female. So they find some site that has a little bit of cover, a lot of solar exposure, but open enough for them to be able to dig a nest. And that's our construction site. And they just climb right over the fence. We didn't know they were climbing over the fence. We thought, look, Urtech fencing is, you know, it's made for keeping animals out. They could figure out a way, and they did. So just keep in mind, you may have these kinds of failures as well. It's not the worst thing in the world. We learn a lot from it. But given all of the experience we had on the site and the people who were involved, who had been with the project from beginning to end, all of us were, I'm going to do quote fingers, experts on turtles, certainly experts on turtles at this site. And we did an enhancement project and still killed turtles. Not just nestlings either. We killed 4 adults, and that's another story. So just be ready for it. It's going to happen, and you have to anticipate this.
Jeff, I have a question.
Yeah.
For the AirTech fencing that was used, did it have that like appropriate bend at the top? Did the turtle still make it over that? I know
Yeah.
that I've used that fence, and if you don't maintain it like 100% every single day, it kind of fails itself. But I'm just curious.
It did, and that is a problem. And you're right about the maintaining it, because we have otters on the site, and they just plow right over it and knock the little brackets off that hold the overhang on it. So we spent, I think, $8,000 on the Urtech fencing just for the product, and another $70,000 getting it installed, and all of it got ripped out. And we put in Animex fencing, which is a solid surface fencing, and we never had another problem. And I don't own part of Animex. I don't care if they succeed or fail, but I never use Urtech anymore for any project. I only use Animex because it's unclimbable, but also because it's made of recycled material and it's recyclable. Urtech goes to the dump, and it's hard to pull out of the ground because it tears at the ground level. So I do like Animex. I don't really care if they succeed or fail, but I like the product a lot. Turtles cannot climb it, it's too smooth. Neither can lizards or mice or any other thing. We've used it on saltmarsh harvest mice, blunt-nosed leopard lizard, lots of things. We really like the product. Doesn't matter if they get any new business from you guys or not. I'm just saying that's what we would use, because if an animal can climb it, they're going to climb it. And maintenance can happen. You can be there every single day, but you weren't there at night, so you can't figure out what happened at night. And if something pushes through and makes a hole, now you have access and you're going to have new problems. So we use Animex,
Yeah.
but up to you what you use.
No, I'm totally on the Animex route too with that after what I experienced in my project.
Yeah.
And even with the AirTech, the parts that overlap, there would be gaps in that over time, and that was just terrible. So like
Yeah.
it was just a complete mess. But don't mean to knock the company.
No,
Sure, they're
no.
good for other projects and whatever.
I guess they are. The guy who owns Urtech has called me many, many, many times. I'll probably even get an email today. He's unhappy with me, but I just say, listen, I'm only just basing this on my own experience. I don't want mortality. If you get mortality from Urtech, and you see it right here in the photo, I'm not doing it. And especially if this becomes federally listed. I mean, the state gives you little leeway. It's only a species of concern, but federal government's highly sensitive to this species right now. So, Animex for me. This is just sort of to remind you that these turtles are tiny. They're very, very small, hard to find. They can hide under a dirt clod. You can step on that dirt clod as you're walking and kill a turtle. Just be aware that this is going to be a tricky situation we're going to encounter as this thing becomes federally listed. And we're going to have to be pretty vigilant. And ideally, if you have failures of any kind, if those things could be shared, we will learn so much by the failures as much as we would learn from the successes, because we will repeat the failures if we're not hearing about it. And that's why I'm open to sharing my own failures, given my own experience, and I think I have a lot of it. We still have failures, and I want people to learn from those things. So generally speaking, this comes from me. You're hearing my experiences. But the idea is that we read lots and lots and lots of papers too, some of which we've written. So we have access to all of this stuff. These are the papers I've used, you know, and sort of, I'm not citing them because I don't want to tell you every single one when I mention it, but I'm mentioning these to let you know these are the important nesting papers. You're more than welcome to like take a snapshot of this, but I will send you a link to, I don't know why it's dropping out of my head. Oh, Dropbox. I have a Dropbox file share where I will send you a link to all those files. We have about 150 papers on pond turtles. These are the nesting ones. I'll give you also a little sort of a map to all the papers so it describes what they're talking about, so you don't have to read every single paper. Nobody wants to do that, even though you should. But we should read these nesting papers to get a better grasp of nesting, because nesting is going to be tricky. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be fun for the first couple of years after this thing gets listed. And we'll talk a lot about that in the field, because there are some tricks to making it easier on yourself, easier on the turtles, and maybe we can save a few turtles along the way. So field meeting. So a couple of things about the field meeting. So people signed up. We had 2 field days. The site that we use canceled our dates. There's a long story behind that, and I had to pick new dates, and that meant a few people couldn't come. So I had 2 opportunities happen. So the site we're going to use allowed me to pick another day at another day. So we have the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. The 24th is full. The 22nd and 23rd are not full. And because the people who initially signed up, who had one of the 2 initial days, have not responded, I would ask that you respond. Not everybody has joined this meeting, so I will still not hear from everybody. But I'll ask you to respond today if you can with a date that you want, either the 23rd or the 22nd. And the open spots after today, I'm going to give to anybody on the waiting list if they want to come. I'm just going to welcome anybody I can squeeze in, because I think this is a really important thing for you guys to learn and to know and to have experience with, so we can save as many turtles as we can. For those who are going to make it, and for those who might be able to make it, our site is, there's just going to be a few slides. Our site is in Martinez. It's at the wastewater treatment plant. This is Moorhen Marsh. It's at the Mountain View Sanitary District. They have these 6 ponds. There are 6 ponds here. This is the site where we did the habitat restoration for turtles. There's a slough that goes through the center, which goes out to the delta, and that's why this is an open population. Turtles can come on in at will, and we generally have mostly pond turtles. We have a population about 150, with a few red-eared sliders that make it in that if we catch, we will take home with us. We will be trapping on this site in addition to doing the turtle nesting searches during your field day that you've picked. The trapping is really meant to give you guys some handling experience, show you what the traps look like, how I set them, the bait I use. We're going to look a little bit at sex, so male versus female. We're going to show you how to age them. If there are any parasites, we'll definitely pluck those off and put those in a vial. There are lots of things we can do when we're trapping. Those are good experiences, good to take some photos. Primarily what we're going to be doing is walking around this marsh looking for nesting turtles. So the females will be coming out this time of year trying to find a nest site. We will also be looking for predated nests. We might find 5 or 10. One year we found 40. We'll look at those, talk about those. But what you learn from that is that was where a nest was. This is where they want to nest. And are there groups of those? And what you'll find out is that there is high nest site fidelity for turtles. If a turtle lives 30 years and it finds a good nesting spot, it's going to nest there every single year. So we're going to use this site to our advantage. It's not very big, so we can walk around it. We'll probably divide into groups and have different groups go around and text each other if we find a nesting turtle or a nest. This is going to give you a lot of opportunity to see that nesting turtle searches, even on a tiny site like this that has very little upland and is completely fenced, is still super hard. So if you have a pond out in the middle of a grassland, you're never going to find a nest. You just aren't. And you could hire somebody like me who has a whole team of people who do this, and we will still say, you're just wasting your money. Just, put a big circle on your map and say, oh, this has to be protected. If you can. And if you can't, you should really just trap all the turtles, find out how many females you have, use my formula to calculate how many you're going to kill that year, and accept it, because that's the way it's going to end up going. Now, nobody will do that, but that's the way it should go. So again, we have turtles out there with telemetry units. They're pretty wily now, and they aren't easy to trap, but we're hoping to trap one to change its unit, and we'll do all that stuff if we're out there. And then just to give you some idea, there are red-eared sliders. So the red dots on this have been red-eared slider nests. The white dots have been the recent pond turtle nests that we found out there. All of them predated. The predated nests can be obscured by maintenance activity. So hopefully we'll see a few out there. They're going to be doing some habitat manipulation when we're out there. So they're doing some weeding and planting and stuff. So some of that is kind of a real world experience. There's it's an active site, so we'll walk around all those kinds of things, but we'll be out there from about 3 to 7 or maybe 8-ish. It depends on the group. I'll bring some props out, so show you some eggs, that sort of thing. We're definitely going to try to find as many nests as we can, and we've never been skunked on trapping, so I assume we'll catch skunked meaning caught 0. I assume we're going to catch turtles, so that'll be a big plus. And we'll do the best we can. But the gates will be closed and locked because we're going to be out there Saturday, Sunday, and they'll be open on Monday if Monday is your field date. So I will be standing at the gate, giving you a little sign that says, "Okay, drive here to the parking lot and wait for me there until everybody's here." But it should work out. It's worked out over the last few years very well. Unfortunately, we had to change our dates. I'm really sorry about that. But it's a good site to find turtle nests if we're going to find them. So hopefully that'll all work out. And then typically, this is what we'll see. So this is a predated turtle nest. There's a quarter in the center to give you an idea of the size of the eggs. I find that when I start pointing out predated turtle nests, people say, "Oh, I saw one of those, but I wasn't sure what it was." So we'll have a lot of those experiences, and I think we'll do really well on our field dates. So that's generally going to be about it for the lecture. We kind of sped through it because I was a little nervous we were going to go late, but I don't think anybody ever complains that we go too long. I'm too short. They complain when we go too long. So what I would like to do is I'll just leave the slide up because I may advance slides if we're answering questions, but I will stay as long as you need for me to answer any questions you have that I'm able to answer. If I can't answer them, I'll try to direct you to somebody who can, or I'll make it clear that we just don't know that information. But just assume that we're going to be sort of in relaxed mode, and you can answer any or ask any questions you want. And we won't be recording that piece of it. We'll just stop right here and answer questions.
I've got one just for my own curiosity, not